Nobody clapped when a human walked into the briefing hall. Every other candidate that year had received some kind of reaction. The Teleri warriors got nods of respect, their heavy-scaled bodies drawing admiration from the officers. The Kasari got nervous whispers because everyone knew how fast they could kill. Even Amorite scouts, small as they were, earned polite acknowledgement for their cleverness. But when Corporal Dean Hadley stepped through the door in his plain gray uniform, carrying nothing but a canteen and a calm expression, the room simply looked at him and looked away. He was the first human ever selected for the Verdana 7 survival trial, and nobody expected him to last. Finn, a young Amorite scout with 4 arms and large golden eyes, had been assigned as Dean's orientation guide. He met Dean outside the hall and walked beside him, barely reaching the human's waist. "So, you are the one from Earth?" Finn said. "That is me," Dean replied. "I completed 7 days on Verdana 7 last year. It was the worst experience of my life. The forest does not want you there." Dean looked down at the small alien and smiled. "Forests never do at first." Finn did not understand what that meant, but decided he liked the human anyway. Inside the briefing hall, Instructor Goran stood at the front. He was Teleri, broad as a wall with dark green scales and yellow eyes that had watched hundreds of candidates break down over the years. He ran the survival program with cold efficiency and had 0 patience for weakness. He explained the rules the same way he always did. No weapons, no tools, no communication devices. Each candidate will be dropped alone into the forest with nothing but the clothes on their back and a single emergency beacon. Press the beacon and a shuttle would extract you within the hour. The trial lasted 30 days. No one had ever completed all 30. The current record was 11 days, held by a Teleri commando who had come back shaking and refused to speak about what he had seen. Goran looked at Dean exactly once during the briefing. His eyes moved over the human the way someone looks at an insect on a windowsill, small, fragile, temporary. Verdana 7 is a Category 3 hazard world, Goran said to the room. The forest covers 96% of the planetary surface. The trees are older than most civilizations represented in this room. The wildlife is territorial, venomous, and intelligent. You will not conquer this place. The best you can hope for is to outlast it. After the briefing, candidates gathered in groups. Teleri compared combat scars. Kasari stretched their long limbs and tested their reflexes against each other. Dean stood near a window that overlooked the planet below. Verdana 7 was green, not partly green or mostly green. It was green the way oceans are. Blue, completely and without apology. The forest stretched from pole to pole, broken only by rivers that wound through the canopy like silver veins. Finn appeared at his side. "What are you looking at?" "The rain patterns," Dean said. "See how the clouds gather on the western side? That means the weather comes from that direction. If I build shelter, I want my back to the west." Finn stared at him. In his 7 days on the planet, it had never once occurred to him to study the rain. "You are strange for a human," Finn said. "I'm pretty normal, actually," Dean replied. "Where I grew up, you learn to read the sky before you learn to read books. My grandfather used to say that the land will tell you everything you need to know if you shut up long enough to listen." Finn wanted to ask more, but the drop schedule was announced and Dean's name was called first. Whether that was intentional or random, nobody said. Dean walked to the shuttle bay. Alone, he carried nothing. He wore nothing special. He looked like a man going for a walk, not a soldier entering a survival trial on one of the most dangerous planets in the sector. Goran was standing near the shuttle door. He blocked Dean's path for a moment and looked down at him. The average for your weight class and species is 3 days, Goran said. I have a medical team on standby. Dean met his eyes. Without flinching, you might want to send them home. Goran did not smile. He stepped aside. The shuttle dropped Dean at the edge of a clearing deep inside the northern forest. The canopy was so thick above that the sunlight came through in thin golden threads. The air was warm and heavy with moisture. Every surface was alive with moss, fungus, and crawling things. The shuttle lifted off. The sound of its engines faded into the sky and then into nothing. Dean stood perfectly still. He did not move for almost 20 minutes. He just stood there, breathing slowly, letting his eyes adjust, letting his ears open, letting his skin feel the direction of the breeze. Back on the station, Goran watched the biomonitor and frowned. The human's heart rate had not increased at all. Finn, watching from secondary screen, leaned forward with wide eyes. Dean finally moved. He knelt down and touched the soil. He lifted a handful of earth to his nose and smelled it. He looked at the trees around him, studying the way they grew, which direction their branches reached, where the moss was thickest. Then he whispered something so quietly that the orbital microphones almost missed it. All right, show me what you have got. The forest, ancient and vast and endlessly patient, heard him perfectly, and for the first time in 1,000 years it paid attention. 3 days into the trial, the first beacon lit up on Goran's screen. It belonged to a Kisari predator, one of the fastest species in the galaxy, a creature built for hunting. He had gone in with confidence and come out with a swollen leg and terror in his eyes. The medic said he had stepped on something that stung him through his boot. He would not stop shaking for 2 hours. By day 5, 4 more beacons had fired. Telleri warrior, 2 Amorite scouts, and a species Finn could not even pronounce. All of them came back with stories of the forest closing in on them. Paths that vanished, sounds that followed, a feeling deep in their bones that they were not welcome. Dean had not pressed his beacon. Goran pulled up the humans by readings every morning like a man checking a trap he expected to find empty, heart rate stable, cortisol levels low, sleep cycles regular. The human was sleeping well on Verdana 7. Where no one slept well, there must be a malfunction in the sensor, Goran told his aide. I checked it twice, the aide replied. The readings are accurate. Goran said nothing. He just stared at the screen as if Dean's calm heartbeat was a personal insult. Down on the planet, Dean was doing what no other candidate had ever thought to do. He was being patient. On his first day he had walked slowly through the forest, studying everything. He did not hack at branches. He did not clear a path. He moved between the trees the way water moves between rocks, finding the gaps. Instead of making them, he found a ridge. On the second day, high ground, good drainage, natural windbreak from a cluster of thick trunk trees. He built his shelter there using fallen branches and broad leaves, weaving them together the way his grandfather had taught him. When he was 9 years old, the shelter Faced east, its back to the western. Rain exactly as he had planned from. Orbit by the third day he had found. Water not by wandering randomly but by watching where the animals went at dawn. A small river ran through a gully about 10 minutes from his shelter. The water was clear and cold, filtered through layers of root and stone. He drank carefully. He tested small amounts first and waited. When nothing happened, he drank more. Every decision was measured. Every action was slow and deliberate. Other candidates had tried to dominate the forest. They built fires to scare off predators. They marked territory. They moved aggressively through the undergrowth, treating the trial like a war. Dean treated it like a conversation. On day 4 he noticed the first strange thing. A branch that had blocked a narrow path in the morning was angled differently by afternoon. Not broken, not fallen, just moved as if someone had gently pushed it aside. He stopped and looked at it for a long time. On day 5 fruit appeared near his shelter. 3 round purple things sitting on a flat rock that had been empty the night before. He studied them carefully, compared them to other plants nearby, and eventually ate one. It was sweet and heavy with juice. On day 6 a predator found him. It was long and low, something between a lizard and a wolf, with 6 legs and a mouth full of teeth that glowed faintly in the dark. It watched Dean from the edge of his camp. For an entire night, Dean watched it. Back, he did not run. He did not try to fight it. He sat quietly by his shelter and kept his breathing steady. By morning, the predator was gone. On day 7 it rained hard. Dean stayed dry in his shelter and listened to the water pour through the canopy above. The sound was enormous, like the entire planet was breathing. And in that moment, sitting in the dark with rain hammering the leaves above him, Dean did something that the orbital microphones picked up. But nobody on the station understood. He said thank you, just that, 2 words, spoken to no one, or so it seemed. Back on the station, Finn was obsessing. He had pulled up Earth's file from a Union database and was reading everything he could find about humans and their relationship with nature. What he found amazed him. Humans had lived in forests for hundreds of thousands of years. They had names for different types of rain. They could predict weather by watching birds. They formed emotional bonds with rivers, mountains, and trees. They planted gardens not just for food, but because growing things made them feel less alone. No other species in the Union database had anything like this. Most species used nature. Humans loved it. Finn brought his findings to Garen. The instructor glanced at the data and pushed it aside. Sentiment does not keep you alive on Verdana 7, Garen said. It is on day 7, Finn replied quietly. That matches my record. Garen looked at the screen. Dean's heartbeat pulsed steadily, calmly, like a man asleep in his own bed. He is lucky, Garen said, but even he did not sound sure anymore. Down on the planet, Dean finished his rain shelter repairs and stepped outside into the wet morning air. The forest smelled alive, rich and deep like soil after a storm. He looked up at the canopy where drops of water fell like tiny silver coins, and he smiled. Something in the forest smiled back. The last beacon besides Dean's went dark on day 11. It belonged to a Tellurian commando named Roth, the toughest candidate in the program. Soldier who had survived 3 combat deployments and once held a defensive position for 40 hours without sleep. He lasted 11 days on Verdana 7 and came back hollow-eyed with his claws worn down to nothing from digging escape roots through root systems that kept regrowing around him. When Garen asked what happened, Roth just shook his head and said, "It knows you are there. It always knows." That left Dean alone on the planet, the only active signal on the entire board. Day 12, Garen stood in front of the monitoring station with his arms crossed, staring at the single green dot on the map. Around him, officers from 6 different species watched in silence. This had never happened before. No candidate had ever been the last one standing and still shown no signs of distress. His cortisol is lower than when he landed. An analyst said quietly, "That is not possible." Garen replied, "It is what the data shows." Finn sat in the corner of the monitoring room surrounded by data pads. He'd spent the last 5 days reading everything he could find about humans and wilderness survival. What he learned had changed the way he thought about the entire species. Humans did not just survive in hostile environments. They adapted to them. They lived in frozen wastelands, burning deserts, dense jungles, and open oceans. They built shelters from snow. They navigated by stars. They tamed wolves and turned them into companions. They planted crops in volcanic soil and called it farming. But the thing that shook Finn the most was a single entry in the human cultural database. It described a practice called forest bathing, where humans walked in a forest not to hunt, not to harvest, not to train, but simply to be near the trees. They believed it healed them. They believed the forest could feel them. There, Finn read that passage 4 times, and then looked at Dean's biodata with new eyes. On the planet, Dean woke on the morning of day 12 to something he had not seen before. The ground around his shelter was covered in bioluminescent moss. It glowed a soft, pale blue, spreading out from the base of the nearest trees in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like writing, like art. Dean sat up slowly and looked at it for a long time. He had noticed things changing over the past few days. The forest was behaving differently. Around him, fruit appeared more often. Water seemed closer. The sounds at night had shifted from threatening to something that felt almost like music. Low vibrations that hummed through the ground and up through his chest while he slept. He had a theory, but it was the kind of theory that would make a scientist laugh and a poet nod. He stood up and walked. The forest opened for him, not dramatically, not like a door swinging wide, but vines that had been across the path yesterday were curled aside now. Branches that would have blocked his way leaned gently to the left. The ground was soft and clear under his feet, as if something had smoothed it during the night. He followed the path for almost an hour, deeper into the forest than he had ever gone. The trees grew taller here, their trunks wider than buildings, their roots rising from the soil in great arches that formed natural tunnels. Light filtered down in golden shafts through gaps in the canopy far above, and then he reached the clearing. It was enormous, a perfect circle of open ground surrounded by the largest trees Dean had ever seen. In the center stood a single tree that made the others look like saplings. Its trunk was so wide that Dean could not see around it. Its roots spread outward like a mountain range in miniature, forming ridges and valleys across the forest floor. The bark pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Dean stood at the edge of the clearing and did not move. He could feel it, not hear it, not see it, feel it, a presence so vast and so old that his mind could barely hold the shape of it. It was in the ground beneath his feet, in the air. He was breathing in the light that touched his skin. The forest was alive. Not in the way trees are alive, alive. The way a mind is alive. He walked to the great tree slowly, respectfully, the way you approach something sacred. He placed his hand on the bark, and the forest spoke, not in words, in feelings, in images that flooded his mind like memories that were not his own. He saw centuries of candidates arriving on the planet, struggling, fighting, screaming, and leaving. He saw the forest watching them all with something that felt like curiosity and something that felt like grief. Every single one had fought it. Every warrior, every predator, every brilliant mind from every species in the galaxy had treated the forest as an enemy to be outlasted. Dean was the first one who had listened. The presence showed him what it was, a planetary consciousness, a network of roots and fungal threads and chemical signals spanning the entire world. It had no name, it had no voice. It had been alone for longer than most civilizations had existed. The last species that had understood it was gone, erased in a war that left the forest without a companion. For thousands of years, Dean felt the loneliness of it like a weight on his chest, ancient and heavy and quiet. He sat down at the base of the great tree, pressed his back against the warm bark, and closed his eyes. I hear you, he said softly. I am here. The glow in the bark brightened, and somewhere far above on the station, every sensor monitoring Verdana 7 flickered at once. Dean stopped counting the days after the clearing. Time moved differently now. Not faster or slower, just less important. The sun rose and set above the canopy, and he noticed it the way you notice your own breathing, present but not urgent. What mattered was the forest and the slow, patient conversation happening between it and the only creature who had ever bothered to listen. He called the presence Nia. He named it after a river near his childhood home in Montana, a quiet stretch of water that wound through Pine Valley and never seemed to be in a hurry. His mother used to take him there when he was small, and she would say that the river had been there before anyone and would be there after everyone, and that the best thing you could do near something that old was sit down and be grateful. Nia felt like that river, old, calm and endlessly patient. Every night Dean returned to the great tree and pressed his back against the bark, and the forest shared more of itself with him, not in words, never in words, in feelings, images, and memories that moved through his mind like dreams he could not quite hold. He saw what the planet used to be. Thousands of years ago, a species had lived among these trees. They were small, soft-bodied, and gentle. They did not build cities or machines. They wove their homes from living branches and sang to the roots that fed them. They understood what the forest was, and they loved it, and the forest loved them back. And then they were gone. A war between two galactic powers swept through the system. Neither side cared about the little species in the trees. They were collateral. Their song stopped in a single afternoon, and the forest screamed in a frequency that no one was left to hear. Dean felt that scream echo through the images, and it sat in his chest like a stone. Since then the forest had been alone. It grew, it spread, it covered the planet in green and waited. Candidates came and went brought by the Union for their survival trials, and the forest tested every single one, not to see who was strongest, not to see who was fastest, to see if any of them could do what those gentle singers had done, to see if any of them could feel. None of them could until Dean. During the day, the forest transformed around him. Paths led him to groves of fruit that tasted like nothing he had ever eaten on earth. Streams appeared where he needed water. Dangerous creatures that roamed the undergrowth avoided his area completely, redirected by shifts in the root system. Below their feet, he slept in the roots of the great tree every night, curled in a natural hollow that fit his body perfectly. The bioluminescent moss grew thicker around him each day, painting the ground in soft blue light that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He was not surviving anymore. He was living. On the station, Georan watched all of this with growing alarm. Dean's neural activity had changed. His brainwave patterns showed readings that did not match any known human baseline. There were spikes of activity in regions associated with empathy, connection, and spatial awareness, firing at levels that should have been impossible without external stimulation. But his stress hormones were nearly zero. His immune system was functioning perfectly. His body temperature, blood pressure, and oxygen levels were all ideal. By every medical metric, Dean was the healthiest human a monitor has ever recorded. He is being manipulated, Georan said during a staff meeting. The planet is altering his brain chemistry, or he is communicating, Lieutenant Sarah Doss replied from the far end of the table. She had been monitoring Dean's mission from the Union's Human Liaison Office and had made the trip to Perihelion Station specifically because of what she was seeing in the data. She was sharp, practical, and not easily impressed, but even she could not deny that something extraordinary was happening. His neural patterns are consistent with deep social bonding, Sarah continued, the same patterns humans show when they form close relationships. He is not being controlled, he is connecting. Georan slammed his fist on the table. With a planet, that is not possible. A year ago, you would have said a human lasting 12 days on Verdana 7 was not possible. Either. The room went quiet. Finn, sitting in the back, raised one of his 4 hands. I've been studying the planet's root network. The fungal threads beneath the surface carry electrical signals identical to neural pathways. The entire forest is one connected system. It is not just grow. It thinks. Georan stared at him. You are telling me the trees have a brain. I'm telling you the planet is the brain, Finn said. Silence again. Down on the planet, Dean sat beneath the great tree as the sun set and the moss around him began to glow. Naya was showing him something new tonight, a memory of the first time it had felt rain, a memory so old that the continents had been in different positions when it happened. Dean laughed, not because it was funny, because it was beautiful. He pressed his palm flat against the bark and closed his eyes, and the forest wrapped its awareness around him like a blanket. Finn's voice echoed in Georan's office later that night, quiet and certain. The forest is not testing him anymore. It's keeping him. The extraction shuttle hit turbulence before it even broke through the cloud layer. Georan sat in the command seat with 6 armed Teleri soldiers behind him and a medical team strapped in at the rear. He had filed the extraction order that morning over Sarah Doss's objections. over Finn's protests and over the confused silence of the Union Oversight Committee, who were still trying to understand why a routine survival trial had turned into a first contact debate. Georg did not care about debates. He cared about protocol. A soldier was on a hostile planet showing abnormal brain activity, and that meant extraction. End of discussion. The shuttle punched through the canopy and landed hard in a clearing 2 km from Dean's last known position. The trees here were dense and dark, their branches woven so tightly overhead that almost no light reached the ground. The air was thick, warm, and it smelled like wet earth and something older. Move out, Georg ordered. Team formed up and pushed into the forest. Within 10 minutes they knew something was wrong. The path they had mapped from orbit did not exist, where satellite imagery showed a clear route. Through the trees there was nothing but a wall of roots and vines so thick that cutting through it would take hours. The lead soldier tried to force his way through, and a branch snapped back and knocked him flat. Go around, Georg said. They went around. The new path led them in a wide curve that added 30 minutes to the march. When they corrected course, the forest corrected with them. Every time they turned toward Dean's position, something blocked the way. A fallen tree that had not been there on the scans, a gully full of dark water that appeared from nowhere, thorn plants that grew across the path so fast you could almost watch them move. Wildlife changed too. Creatures that the database listed as passive became aggressive. Small things with too many legs dropped from branches onto the soldier's armor. A 6-legged predator, the same kind that had stalked Dean in his first week, appeared on a ridge above them and let out a sound so low and deep that the soldiers felt it in their teeth. It is hurting us, one of the soldiers said. It is a forest. Georg snapped. Forests do not hurt. But he gripped his weapon tighter. They pushed forward for 2 more hours, fighting for every meter. By the time they reached the great clearing, 3 soldiers had minor injuries and a medical officer had been stung by something that made his left arm go numb. The clearing was just as Dean had described in his earliest days, a perfect circle of open ground with the great tree rising in the center. But now the tree was glowing, not faintly, not subtly. It pulsed with warm golden light that radiated outward in waves, and the air around it hummed with a vibration that Georg could feel in his bones. Dean was sitting at the base of the tree, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. The bioluminescent moss had crept up his legs and arms, not growing on him but around him like a frame around a portrait. His face was calm, peaceful in a way that made Georg uncomfortable. Corporal Hadley, Georg said. Stand up. Dean opened his eyes. They were still human, brown and warm, but there was something behind them now, a depth that had not been there before. He looked at Georg the way you look at a loud noise in a quiet room, with patience and a little sadness. You should not have come, Dean said. You are being extracted. Your brain activity is compromised. This is not a request. Dean stood slowly. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had expected this and wished it had not happened. She is not hurting me, Dean said. She has never hurt anyone, not once in all the years you have been sending soldiers here. She, Georg asked. Nea, the forest. She is alive. Georg, not like a plant is alive, like a person is alive. She thinks she Remembers she has been alone for thousands of years because the last people who understood her were killed in a war they had nothing to do with. She has been testing every candidate you send down here, not to see who is the strongest, to see if anyone could feel what she feels. Georan stared at him. You are telling me a forest has feelings? I'm telling you a planet has a soul, and you're standing in her living room with guns. The soldiers shifted behind Georan, the humming in the air grew louder. Georan set his jaw. I have orders, Corporal, you're coming with us, he signaled the soldiers. Forward. The ground shook, not an earthquake, something slower and more deliberate. The roots of the great tree rose from the soil like walls, curving upward on either side of Dean, forming a barrier between him and the extraction team. The glow in the bark intensified until it was almost blinding. Every tree in the clearing leaned inward, their branches reaching toward the soldiers. Like fingers, the soldiers raised their weapons. Georan held up his fist to stop them. Dean stepped between the roots and faced Georan directly. He was calm, completely calm. The forest roared behind him, alive and furious, but Dean himself was still. She will not hurt you, Dean said, but you need to leave. This is not your decision to make. It is mine. Georan looked into the human's eyes and saw something he had never seen in any candidate on any planet in 20 years of running this program. He saw someone who was exactly where they were meant to be. The ground shook again. Humming rose to pitch that made the soldiers cover their ears. Georan, for the first time in his career, gave the order to retreat. The transmission arrived on day 30, exactly when the trial was supposed to end. It did not come from Dean's beacon. The beacon had been sitting untouched in his pocket for the entire month, its signal quiet and steady, never once pressed. Transmission came from the planet itself, broadcast on a frequency that the Union had never detected from Verdana 7 in all its years of monitoring. Sarah Das was the first to hear it. She was sitting alone in the communications room on Perihelion Station, drinking cold coffee and reviewing Georan's extraction report for the third time, when her console lit up with an incoming signal. The frequency was impossibly low, almost below the range of the equipment, and it carried no voice, no data stream, no standard communication protocol. It carried a feeling. Every person on the station who was near a speaker or a screen felt it. At the same time, a warmth in the chest, a sense of calm so deep and so complete that two officers in the hallway stopped walking and just stood there breathing, unsure of what had just happened. Then the words appeared on Sarah's screen, translated by the system from raw electromagnetic patterns into simple text. He stays, he is welcome, he is home. Sarah read it 3 times. Then she picked up her communicator and called an emergency session. The Union Council chamber was full. Within that hour, representatives from 11 species sat around the curved table, and the debate was loud and ugly from start. Telluride delegate demanded a full military expedition to recover Dean and neutralize whatever biological agent had compromised him. The Kesari representative argued that Verdana 7 should be quarantined and reclassified as a Category 5 threat. 3 other delegates suggested orbital bombardment of the Great Tree to sever the neural network. Sarah Das stood at the front of the room and waited for them to finish shouting. When the noise finally died down, she activated a holographic display that showed the planet's route. Network mapped in glowing blue lines. It looked like a brain. It looked like a nervous system. It looked like something that was undeniably, unmistakably alive. "This is Verdana 7, she said, "not the surface, the entire planet, every root, every fungal thread, every chemical signal passing between every tree on every continent. It is one connected organism. It has been alive and aware for longer than any civilization in this room has existed." She let that settle. Corporal Hadley did not lose his mind on that planet. He made first contact with a sentient being that we have been using as a training ground for decades. We dropped soldiers onto its skin and treated it like an obstacle course, and it never once killed anyone. It just waited. It waited for someone who would stop fighting and start listening. Telluride delegate opened his mouth. Sarah cut him off. "If you send a military force to that planet, you will be declaring war on a living world that has shown more patience and restraint than any species in this room. Corporal Hadley is not a prisoner. He is an ambassador, the first one we have ever had, who was chosen not by us, but by the other side." The chamber was silent. Finn asked to go back. He submitted the request that same evening, not as a rescue mission, not as a scientific expedition, but as a visit. The council debated it for 2 days before approving it with conditions. Finn would carry a full biomonitor suite. He would stay no longer than 6 hours. He would not attempt to remove Dean. The shuttle dropped Finn at the same clearing where the extraction team had landed. He stepped out alone, unarmed, and stood in a warm green air with his forearms hanging at his sides. The forest did not block his path. Vines curled aside. Branches lifted. The ground was smooth and soft beneath his feet. He walked for 40 minutes through the most beautiful stretch of wilderness he had ever seen. And nothing threatened him, nothing stung him, nothing made him feel unwelcome. He found Dean sitting beneath the great tree, cross-legged with his hands resting on his knees. The moss around him glowed softly. His skin had darkened from weeks of filtered sunlight, and his hair had grown longer. But he looked healthy, more than healthy. He looked whole. His eyes opened when Finn approached, and they carried a faint bioluminescent glow, barely visible, like starlight reflected in still water. "Hello, Finn," Dean said, and smiled. Finn sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest hummed around them, warm and alive. "Are you all right?" Finn asked. "I'm better than all right. They think you are a prisoner." Dean shook his head slowly. "I'm the opposite of prisoner. I am the first free person this forest has known in 1,000 years. And she is the first home I have had that knew me before I even arrived." Finn looked around at the clearing, at the great tree, at the soft blue light that painted everything in gentle color. He could feel it too. Faintly, a presence, a warmth not as strong as what Dean felt, but enough to understand. "Will you ever come back?" Finn asked. Dean looked up at the canopy, where golden light fell in long, lazy beams through the leaves. "I never left anywhere," he said. "I just finally arrived." Finn stayed for 3 hours. When he left, the forest opened a path for him all the way back to the shuttle, and the last thing he saw before the canopy closed behind him was Dean, standing at the edge of the clearing with one hand on the bark of the great tree, watching him go with quiet, peaceful eyes. On the station, Finn delivered his report to Garen personally. Garen read it in silence. When he finished, he did not shout, he did not argue. He set the data pad down on his desk and sat very still for a long time. Then he pulled up the Union database and opened Earth's species file. He had read it before, briefly, the way he read every candidate's file, but this time he scrolled past the combat statistics and the environmental tolerances and the death world classifications until he found a single line buried deep in the cultural assessment section. Humans are the only known species that forms emotional bonds with their environment. Garen read it twice, then he closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and stared out the window at the stars. Somewhere below, on a planet covered green, a man who had been trained to survive had found something better. He had found a place that wanted him to stay, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the forest was no longer alone.